The unauthorized modification of this soldier's rifle magazine was a court-martial offense, yet it saved 50 lives in the fiercest battle of the war. At 2 p.m. on September 17, 1944, Staff Sergeant Thomas Kovac was suspended 800 feet above the small town of Groesbeck, Holland, secured in the open door of a C-47 transport plane. In his grasp was a standard-issue M1 Carbine, except for one critical part that violated every military maintenance guide. Kovac, a 28-year-old veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, carried 6 specialized magazines clipped to his fighting gear. These held 110 rounds, and each magazine contained twice the number of feeding springs specified by Army ordnance. This illegal adjustment made the weapons utterly reliable, even in the severe conditions that had caused other paratroopers' gear to fail. The signal light above the door switched to red in the plane's dim interior. 17 men stood hooked to the static line behind Kovac, awaiting their drop command. Outside, through the open hatch, black bursts of German 88mm anti-aircraft fire blossomed against the deep afternoon sky. The transport jolted violently. Shrapnel fragments clanged against the fuselage. The light flashed green. Kovac launched himself into the void. 4 seconds of pure freefall. His parachute deployed with a sudden jolt, stealing his breath. He looked earthward. Below were beet fields and a distant tree line, perhaps 300 yards to the east. From the edge of the woods, small muzzle flashes erupted. Germans, at least a squad. Kovac impacted the ground roughly. He rolled, then quickly jettisoned his chute harness in less than 8 seconds. Rounds whizzed past his head. He unslung the M1 Carbine, chambered a round from the customized magazine, and aimed at the woods. A 3-round burst. The weapon functioned perfectly. Another burst. The reinforced magazine spring applied approximately 18 pounds of pressure, forcefully pushing cartridges into the firing position. This was enough to counteract the dirt from his hard landing and the mud already caking the lips of the feed mechanism. 15 rounds expended. Kovac quickly discarded the empty clip, snapped in a second customized magazine, and resumed firing. 12 more rounds, not a single jam. Other paratroopers were landing near him, some in the open field, some caught in the tall trees. The German unit in the tree line maintained a steady rate of fire. Then, an MG-42 heavy machine gun opened up, its unique, rapid 1,200 round per minute sound ripping through the air like a relentless electric saw. Kovac moved toward a shallow drainage ditch, firing continuously as he advanced. The modified magazine fed flawlessly. No hesitation, no failures to chamber, just consistent, reliable fire from a weapon that shouldn't have worked so well, but did, because Kovac had taken unauthorized steps to correct its flaw 3 days prior. Just 3 months earlier, this same style of weapon had failed his best friend, costing the man his life. The M1 Carbine was meant to be the perfect combat weapon. Lightweight, only 7 pounds fully loaded compared to the 11-pound M1 Garand. It was compact, only 3 feet long compared to the Garand's 43 inches, and it featured a 15-round detachable magazine, far superior to the Garand's 8-round on-block clip. It was ideal for paratroopers who needed to carry maximum gear through a small aircraft door at high altitude. The 82nd Airborne received their carbines in late 1942. Initial evaluations at Fort Benning indicated superb reliability. The paratroopers loved them. They could unleash 15 shots without a reload and carry 60 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition for the same weight as 48 rounds of the larger .30-06. The logistics were sound, but only on paper. In the harsh reality of combat, the M1 Carbine carried a hidden, lethal flaw that was killing American paratroopers from the beaches of Normandy to the canals of the Netherlands. The tension of the magazine spring was entirely inadequate for field conditions. The magazine utilized a single coil spring to lift rounds up into the chamber. The Army's official standard called for 14 pounds of compression force when the spring was new. That worked perfectly in peacetime Georgia. Clean weapons, fresh magazines, temperature control, no mud, no continuous firing, and 0 months of continuous field exposure. But in a war zone, everything broke down. Fine dirt worked its way into the magazine's feed lips, mud clogged the spring housing, moisture caused rust on the spring coils, and repeated compression from loading and unloading weakened the metal temper.
After just 60 days in the field, the magazine spring tension routinely dropped from 14 pounds down to 9 or 10 pounds, and 9 pounds was simply insufficient. It was not enough to reliably push rounds into the chamber against battlefield contamination. It was not enough to overcome the carbon buildup on the feed ramp. It was not enough to function when a paratrooper's survival depended on the weapon firing instantly. By September 1944, the 82nd Airborne had compiled 47 official reports detailing M1 Carbine magazine failures during intense combat. 47 incidents where soldiers pulled the trigger and heard a dry, sickening click instead of a shot. 47 equipment failure reports filed through the proper chain of command. Some of those soldiers who suffered the failures managed to clear the jam, get their rifles working, and survive. Others were not so lucky. They perished with fully loaded magazines in weapons that simply would not fire. Private First Class Danny Morrison was one of those names. Kovac's past was rooted in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where his father spent his days in the steel mills, returning home smelling of metal dust and furnace smoke. Kovac learned early that surviving meant truly comprehending how mechanisms functioned, tools, machines, and the physics of stress and breaking points. He enlisted in March 1942 at the age of 26. He was older than most recruits, having already logged 8 years as a professional machinist, learning about tolerances, spring tension, and metal fatigue under immense stress. He volunteered for the paratroopers. Everyone told him it was foolish. You're 26, too old to be jumping out of aircraft. Get a safer job. Use your skills in a motor pool. Kovac went to Fort Benning anyway. He completed jump school and was assigned to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne. By June 1944, he had earned the rank of Staff Sergeant and Squad Leader. His 9 men trusted him to keep them alive through diligent preparation and competence, not random chance. Kovac's leadership style was deeply analytical. Every morning, he completely stripped and inspected every rifle in his squad, checking bolt wear, examining firing pins, measuring trigger pull. He found problems before they became fatal. His men respected him because he refused to accept "that's just how the equipment is" as an answer for a malfunction. If a component was faulty, Kovac discovered the root cause and fixed it. But on the morning of June 7, 1944, Kovac could not fix what happened to Danny Morrison quickly enough to save his life.
June 7, 1944, 8:30 a.m. The Normandy hedgerow country near Saint-Mère-Église. Kovac's squad was clearing enemy positions, navigating the ancient earthen banks and dense vegetation that transformed every French field into a defensive fortress. The Germans leveraged this terrain brilliantly. PFC Danny Morrison served as Kovac's assistant squad leader, 20 years old, from Chicago. He had worked as a mechanic before the war. He and Kovac had trained together, jumped on D-Day, and survived the disorganized drop when half the regiment landed miles from their intended zones. Morrison was capable, professional, and meticulous, the kind of soldier who double-checked his gear and kept his weapon clean even when everyone else was too exhausted to care. The squad encountered a German MG-42 machine gun nest dug into a hedgerow about 200 yards ahead. Kovac spotted it first. He ordered Morrison to take 3 men and flank left, while Kovac provided cover fire with his M1 Garand. This was standard operating procedure: fire and maneuver. Keep the enemy heads down while the flanking element moves into position. Kovac fired his Garand. 8 rounds, methodical, aimed shots into the German nest. The MG-42 briefly fell silent. The Germans took cover. Morrison moved left with his 3 men, using the hedgerow for concealment. They reached a point about 50 yards from the German position, the perfect angle, a perfect opportunity. Morrison rose to engage the enemy from their vulnerable flank. He sighted his M1 Carbine on the MG-42 crew and pulled the trigger. Nothing. Magazine failure. The feed lips were packed with thick Norman mud, a sticky clay that infiltrated every part of the weapon. The magazine spring, already fatigued from 2 weeks of continuous field use, lacked the pressure needed to push the next round past the packed debris.
Morrison instantly tried to clear the malfunction. Sound effects: single click, then struggle. He dropped the faulty magazine and reached for a fresh one. The German MG-42 gunners spotted him standing exposed. 3 seconds later, 7.92mm rounds struck Morrison in the chest and throat. He collapsed backward into the dense vegetation. His M1 Carbine fell from his hands. Kovac watched the entire scene unfold. He was at the wrong angle to provide cover fire, too far to help. All he could do was watch Morrison fall. A weapon that clicks is a grave marker. It took 3 agonizing hours to secure the German position and reach Morrison's location. Morrison was still holding the carbine when Kovac found him. The empty magazine was lying on the ground next to him, fully loaded with 15 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition. Morrison had died attempting to reload a rifle that should have fired the first time. Kovac picked up the magazine, examined it, and pressed the follower down with his thumb. He felt the weak resistance, perhaps 9 pounds of spring tension. Not 14, not nearly enough. The feed lips were entirely clogged with mud and grass stems. A properly tensioned spring would have easily forced the rounds past the contamination. Morrison's degraded spring failed. The fault was not the soldiers. Morrison had done everything right, kept his weapon as clean as possible, stored his magazines properly, followed all procedures. The flaw was the spring itself. Kovac knelt beside Morrison's body for a long moment. He reflected on the difference between 14 pounds and 9 pounds. He contemplated the gap between a rifle that fires and a weapon that clicks. 5 pounds of spring tension was the difference between life and death. That night, while helping bury Morrison in a makeshift grave near the fatal hedgerow, he made a solemn vow. This failure was unacceptable. No more men under his command would die because their magazines jammed. Not if he could prevent it. Kovac held on to Morrison's failed magazines and took them back to his bivouac area for study. Between June and August 1944, throughout the Normandy campaign and during the short rest periods between fighting, Kovac collected damaged and failed magazines from other paratroopers. He assembled a sample set of 18 clips that had experienced combat malfunctions. He tested each one, pressing the follower, estimating the compression force manually. He found a chillingly consistent pattern. Every failed magazine had spring tension that had degraded to between 8 and 11 pounds, every single one, no exceptions. Kovac compared them to new magazines from the supply depot. Fresh magazines measured a full 14 pounds, fed perfectly, and worked exactly as designed. But even those new magazines degraded. Kovac tracked their use. After 30 to 40 days of hard field use, even the factory fresh magazines showed reduced spring tension. The single-coil spring design lacked any safety redundancy. Moisture seeped into the magazine body. Continuous compression from loading and unloading caused permanent spring distortion. The high-carbon steel lost its crucial temper. Kovac attempted to obtain replacement springs through official channels. He filed equipment request forms, going through his platoon sergeant, who went to the company supply sergeant, who went to battalion supply. The requests were denied. Replacement magazine springs were not available. They were a low supply priority. The logistics chain was focused on essentials: ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Small repair parts like magazine springs were not reaching the front lines. The Army Ordnance Department's official stance was unambiguous. The problem was not the equipment design. The problem was poor soldier maintenance. Soldiers simply needed to clean their weapons more frequently and keep their magazines dry and free of contamination. But Kovac understood this position was fundamentally wrong. Sound effects, rain, mud squish. How could anyone keep a magazine dry in Normandy in June? It rained constantly. They were sleeping in flooded foxholes. They were wading through rivers. They were moving through wet grass and waterlogged fields. And no soldier could effectively clean a magazine spring in the middle of a firefight. You might get 5 minutes between engagements to wipe down the bolt and check the chamber. There was no time to completely dismantle magazines and clean the internal components. The Army Ordnance position was based on the assumption of peacetime conditions, of garrison duty, where there was ample time for proper care. Combat was not peacetime. Combat was mud, relentless rain, sustained firing, and equipment that either worked or guaranteed death. Kovac desperately needed a fix that would function under combat conditions, not just on a Georgia firing range. He mulled the problem over for weeks, studying the magazine structure, reviewing the physics, and drawing on his years of experience as a machinist. The answer finally crystallized on September 14, 1944, in a staging area in England, just 3 days before the jump into Operation Martin Gayden. September 14, 1944, 9 p.m., 82nd Airborne Staging Area, Southern England. Kovac sat alone in the barracks. Morrison's magazines lay spread across a rough wooden table in front of him. Outside, other paratroopers were playing poker, writing letters home, and cleaning their gear, the customary routine before a major jump. These men were preparing for Operation Martin Gayden, history's largest airborne assault. Kovac was not playing cards. He was intensely focused on 6 M1 Carbine magazines and the mechanics of springs. His machinist background covered this exact design, load distribution, compression characteristics. The physics were straightforward. A coil spring's force output is determined by wire diameter, coil count, material properties, and the compression distance. The M1 Carbine magazine employed a single coil design, manufactured to specification to provide 14 pounds of force. But those specifications were based on ideal conditions: no rust, no metal fatigue, no permanent deformation from constant loading cycles. Real-world conditions were a hellscape. Kovac picked up one of Morrison's magazines, removed the base plate. The spring slid into his hand. He examined it under the harsh barracks light. There was faint rust on a few coils, visible compression where the spring had been fully loaded for weeks. The steel had lost its elasticity. He pressed the spring between his hands, estimating 9 or 10 pounds of resistance. Insufficient. The problem was simple. How do you increase the spring tension when official replacements do not exist? Option 1, stretch the existing spring to increase coil tension. That might add 2 pounds, better than nothing, but still inadequate for reliable feeding in combat. Option 2, use 2 springs instead of 1. Kovac measured the magazine's internal cavity with his fingers. The follower traveled about 4 inches when the magazine was empty. A single compressed spring occupied perhaps 2 inches of that space.
2 springs, if installed correctly, would fit, just barely. The resulting force would be cumulative. 2 14-pound springs would yield 28 pounds when new. Even after degradation to 9 pounds each, the combined total would still be 18 pounds, more than enough to overcome dirt, mud, and carbon buildup. The mathematics worked, but would the physics work? Kovac pulled a second magazine from his collection, disassembled it completely, removing the follower, spring, and base plate. Now he had 2 springs. He manually stretched the first spring, pulling the coils slightly apart to increase the base tension, adding an estimated 2 pounds of compression force. He repeated this with the second spring. Then he attempted to fit both springs into a single magazine body. The first spring slid in easily, seating properly against the base plate. The second spring had to nest inside the first spring's coils. Kovac compressed both springs at the same time, aligned the follower, and held everything in place while he reattached the base plate. It was a struggle, requiring 3 attempts. The springs wanted to bind and twist sideways, but on the third try, everything aligned perfectly.
Kovac slowly released the compressed springs. The follower shot upward with significantly more force than a standard magazine. He pressed it down with his thumb, estimating 18 to 20 pounds of resistance, perhaps more. He loaded 15 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition into the modified clip. The doubled springs pushed the rounds up with such force that loading the final 3 rounds required serious effort. Excellent. That meant the feeding pressure would be extremely high, high enough to overcome any debris. Kovac inserted the modified magazine into his M1 Carbine, manually chambered around, and felt the resistance. The bolt had to work against the increased spring pressure, but it chambered smoothly, no binding, no undue resistance. He removed the magazine and inspected the feed angle. The rounds were positioned correctly. The double spring modification had not altered the geometry. The fix worked, theoretically. But theory was worthless. September 15, 1944, 6 a.m. Kovac walked to the firing range at the edge of the staging area. He brought his modified magazine and 3 standard magazines for comparison, along with 30 rounds of ammunition. The range officer, a lieutenant from the 2nd Battalion, inquired about his activity. "Testing magazine reliability," Kovac replied. The lieutenant simply nodded, letting him continue. Pre-jump weapon testing was encouraged. Better to find problems in England than over the skies of Holland. Kovac loaded the modified magazine with 15 rounds, inserted it, and fired 30 rounds as quickly as he could pull the trigger and reload. 15 rounds from the modified magazine, reload. 15 more rounds from a second modified magazine he had prepared the night before. 0 malfunctions. The weapon fed perfectly. Ejection was positive and clean. The increased spring pressure pushed the rounds into the chamber so forcefully that the feeding was actually faster than with standard magazines. Kovac deliberately did not clean the rifle. He wanted to test the modification under foul, degraded conditions. He loaded a standard, unmodified magazine, fired 15 rounds, reloaded, and fired another 15. At round number 23, the carbine clicked, a malfunction, failure to feed. Kovac cleared the jam and continued firing. At round 28, another failure, same exact mode. The weakened spring in the standard magazine could not generate enough force to push rounds past the carbon buildup in the chamber. The conclusion was undeniable. Modified magazines fed reliably even when dirty. Standard magazines failed after just 30 rounds of continuous firing. Kovac returned to the barracks and spent the next 12 hours modifying 5 more magazines. He systematically disassembled each one, removed the springs, stretched them individually to increase their initial tension, paired them based on similar compression characteristics, and installed 2 springs per magazine body. By midnight on September 15th, Kovac possessed 6 fully modified magazines, a total of 90 rounds, counting the one in his weapon. Every single one was tested and fully functional. He also modified 6 magazines for Corporal James Mitchell, his assistant squad leader. Mitchell had asked about the modification after observing Kovac's range test. He was 23, from Texas, and pragmatic, just like Kovac. He understood that survival demanded working equipment, not rigid adherence to rules that got men killed. Mitchell tested his modified clips on September 16th. The results were identical: 0 failures, flawless feeding under rapid-fire conditions. Word began to spread quietly through the 1st Battalion. Some paratroopers asked Kovac to show them how to perform the modification. He demonstrated the disassembly procedure, showed them how to stretch the springs, and how to install the doubled components. Others refused. It was too risky, too far outside the regulations. What if the modification caused a major weapon failure? What if they were court-martialed for tampering with government property? Kovac understood their worries. The modification violated technical specifications, used non-standard parts, and could theoretically void the weapon's service guarantee. But Morrison had adhered to every regulation, kept his weapon within specs, and died anyway because his spring lacked the tension to overcome Normandy mud. Kovac would risk the court-martial over the risk of combat death. September 16, 1944, 2 p.m. Technical Sergeant Bill Hayes, the company armorer, found Kovac in the barracks modifying magazines for 3 other paratroopers. Hayes was a 15-year career soldier, an expert on small arms, responsible for ensuring every weapon in the company met Army specifications. He watched Kovac work for 2 minutes without speaking, watched him take the clips apart, stretch the springs, and install the doubled components. Then Hayes spoke. "That is an unauthorized modification of issued equipment, Sergeant." Kovac looked up. "Yes, Sergeant." "Violates technical manual specifications." "Yes, Sergeant." "Could result in disciplinary action." "Yes, Sergeant." Hayes pulled up a chair and sat down directly across from Kovac. "Show me how it operates." Kovac demonstrated the process, explained the spring tension problem, showed Hayes the difference between the modified and standard magazines, and described Morrison's death and the 47 documented failures. Hayes listened intently without interruption. When Kovac finished, Hayes picked up a modified magazine and tested the follower pressure with his thumb. He loaded 15 rounds, inserted the clip into a carbine, and chambered a round. "The feed angle looks correct," Hayes noted. "No binding on the bolt carrier." "I've tested it with 300 rounds," Kovac stated. "0 malfunctions." Hayes removed the magazine and closely inspected the spring installation. "You're utilizing 2 springs instead of 1. That provides 18 pounds of pressure even after field degradation. A standard single spring drops to 9 pounds after 60 days. "I am fully aware of the spring degradation issue," Hayes confirmed. "I reported it to Battalion 3 months ago. I requested replacement springs. Request denied." "So you are aware the problem exists?" "I am aware the problem exists," Hayes confirmed.
I also know that soldiers are dying because their magazines will not feed, and I know that Army ordnance is not solving the issue quickly enough." Kovac waited in silence. Hayes held the absolute authority to confiscate the modified magazines. He could initiate charges against Kovac for unauthorized modifications. He could stop this entire effort before Operation Market Garden even began. Hayes stood, handing the modified magazine back to Kovac. "I did not witness this," Hayes declared, "but if you get men killed because your magazines cause a catastrophic weapon failure, I will personally testify at your court-martial that you were explicitly warned." "Understood, Sergeant." "How many have you modified so far?" 12. 6 for me, 6 for Corporal Mitchell." "Do you have sufficient springs for more?" Kovac shook his head. "I am using springs scavenged from damaged magazines. My supply is limited." Hayes simply nodded and walked toward the door. He stopped, turned back. "There is a crate in the supply tent," Hayes said. "It contains damaged magazines slated for depot repair, perhaps 50 clips total. Most have broken feed lips or cracked bodies, but the springs are probably salvageable." "How would someone gain access to that crate, Sergeant?" "The supply tent is not locked during the day. Anyone could wander in." Hayes departed. Kovac waited 30 minutes, then walked to the supply tent, found the crate Hayes mentioned, and pulled 20 springs from magazines that were too damaged for use but had functional spring components. By midnight on September 16, Kovac had acquired enough springs to modify a total of 30 magazines. He worked throughout the night. Other paratroopers began to assist. Mitchell showed men from the 2nd Squad how to stretch the springs and install them properly. Private Eddie Walsh, the squad's BAR gunner, modified magazines for his fire team. By dawn on September 17, 47 paratroopers in the 1st Battalion were carrying modified magazines. The secret was spreading through informal soldier-to-soldier networks. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just proven combat results, and men who refused to die because Army ordnance couldn't deliver small replacement springs.
September 17, 1944, 6 a.m. Final equipment inspection before the Market Garden jump. Kovac stood in formation with his squad. 9 men, full combat load, weapons, ammo, rations, medical supplies, everything they needed to fight in Holland for 72 hours until ground forces linked up. Private First Class Eddie Walsh, 19, from Boston, carried a Browning automatic rifle, 20 pounds of weapon plus 600 rounds of ammunition. Private Henry Hank Chen, 21, a rifleman from San Francisco, carried an M1 Garand with 48 rounds. Private Robert Sullivan, 20, from Detroit, the assistant BAR gunner, carried a Garand plus extra BAR magazines. Corporal James Mitchell, 23, Texas, assistant squad leader, carried an M1 Carbine with 6 modified magazines, 90 rounds total. The 4 other riflemen carried Garands with standard 8-round clips. Kovac carried his M1 Carbine with 6 modified magazines, plus his backup M1 Garand with 48 rounds. He was massively overloaded, 158 rounds total between both weapons. Too much weight for a paratrooper, but he wanted options. The company commander, Captain Robert Jensen, walked down the line, inspecting each man's gear, parachutes, reserve chutes, weapons, and ammunition loads. Jensen stopped in front of Kovac, looking at the M1 Carbine. "Is that weapon serviceable, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "Magazines functional?" "Yes, sir. Tested yesterday on the range." Jensen nodded and moved to the next man. He did not examine the magazines closely. He either didn't know about the modification or chose not to know. Kovac suspected the latter. The battalion briefing was at 8 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Willard Harrison, the battalion commander, stood before a large map of Holland. Drop zones marked in red, objectives in blue, German positions in black. "The 82nd Airborne drops near Groesbeck," Harrison explained. "Our objectives include the bridges at Grave and Nijmegen, plus the high ground east of Groesbeck. Intelligence estimates light German resistance, mostly garrison troops, second-rate infantry. We should secure our objectives within 24 hours. That intelligence was catastrophically wrong, but no one knew it yet. The actual German forces near Arnhem included veteran elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, well-equipped, experienced combat troops, certainly not garrison forces. But intelligence stated light resistance, so that was the expectation. Harrison continued the briefing. Drop altitude, 800 feet. Drop time, 2 p.m. Expect significant anti-aircraft fire over the drop zone. "The Germans know we are coming," Harrison said. "They will have 88s positioned to cover likely drop zones. Stay tight in the door. Exit fast. Do not bunch up on the ground. Standard jump procedures." Nothing was out of the ordinary. Kovac listened with only half his attention. The other half was focused on his modified magazines. Would they perform as well in actual combat as they had on the range? Had he just committed a court-martial offense that would either save lives or doom his men? There was no way to know until the firing started. The battalion briefing concluded at 9 a.m. Kovac gathered his squad, 9 men sitting in a loose circle on the ground outside the barracks. "Equipment check," Kovac ordered. "Everyone verify ammunition counts, weapon function, parachute connections." The men checked their gear. Walsh dry-fired his BAR on a clearing barrel. Chen verified his Garand clips. Sullivan counted BAR magazines. Mitchell sat next to Kovac. Both men carried M1 carbines. Both used modified magazines. "Do you think this will actually hold up?" Mitchell asked quietly. "It functioned on the range. The range is not combat." "No, it is not." Mitchell nodded, saying nothing further. Both men understood the profound gamble. If the modifications failed under fire, men would die. If the modifications worked, men would survive. A simple binary equation. They would know the outcome in about 6 hours. Kovac looked at his squad. 9 men, good soldiers, professional, well-trained. They deserved rifles that worked when they pulled the trigger. Morrison did not receive that. Morrison got a weapon that clicked when he needed it to fire. Kovac would not allow that to happen again, not to his squad, not if the double magazine springs could prevent it. At 11 a.m., the 1st Battalion boarded the C-47 transport aircraft, 17 paratroopers per plane. Kovac's squad was split between 2 planes. Kovac took his seat near the door of the lead aircraft. He watched the coastline of England vanish below, watched the English Channel pass beneath, and then watched the Dutch coast appear on the horizon. He retrieved one of his modified magazines and examined it one last time. The floor plate was slightly bowed from the extreme pressure of the two springs. Anyone looking closely would notice, but no one was looking closely. The magazine held 15 rounds, the doubled springs providing 18 pounds of feed pressure. It had to work in combat. It had to, because in 90 minutes, Kovac would be on the ground in Holland, Germans would be shooting, and his weapon would either fire or it would be useless. Morrison's weapon was useless. Kovac's would not be. He replaced the magazine in his pouch, double-checked his primary parachute connections, checked his reserve, and glanced at the other paratroopers in the aircraft. Some were visibly nervous. This was their first combat jump. Others were utterly calm, veterans of Normandy and Sicily. All of them carried weapons. Some of those weapons would work reliably. Some would not. The difference between survival and death was 5 pounds of spring tension and a soldier willing to defy regulations to protect his comrades. The C-47 crossed the Dutch coast at 1 p.m. German anti-aircraft fire erupted immediately. Black explosions from 88mm flak. The aircraft was rocked violently. Kovac watched the red light above the door. He thought of Morrison. He thought of the 47 documented magazine failures. He thought of doubled springs and unauthorized modifications, and the fact that he was minutes away from learning if breaking the rules was worth the immense risk. The light turned green. Kovac's boots struck the Dutch beat field at exactly 2:07 p.m. He executed a flawless roll, muscle memory from 23 training jumps and 2 combat drops, Normandy, and now Holland. The parachute collapsed behind him. German small arms fire ripped through the air from the tree line 300 yards east. 8 seconds to shed the harness. Kovac released the quick releases, shrugged off the straps, and grabbed his M1 Carbine, which had survived the jump secured to his reserve chute. He yanked the charging handle, chambering a round from the first customized magazine. Muzzle flashes in the tree line, German infantry, at least squad strength. Kovac dropped prone behind a shallow ridge in the beat field. He aimed at the flashes and fired 3 shots. The carbine cycled perfectly. The empty casing ejected. The next round fed effortlessly from the magazine, despite the hard landing and the dirt already fouling the weapon. He fired another 3-round burst, then another. The reinforced magazine spring aggressively pushed cartridges into the chamber with 18 pounds of pressure, easily overriding the field debris. Other paratroopers were landing around him, some in the open, some beyond the woods. One soldier landed 70 yards to Kovac's left, caught in his chute lines, struggling desperately to get free. German fire immediately shifted toward the entangled man. Kovac fired 6 rounds in rapid succession. Suppressive fire. The Germans were forced to take cover. The tangled soldier managed to cut himself free and rolled into a drainage ditch. Kovac's first magazine ran empty after 15 shots. He dropped it, inserted the second modified magazine, 2 seconds, faster than an M1 Garand reload, and he resumed firing. The weapon fed every round. No hesitation, no clicks, no failures. 12 more rounds fired. Movement to Kovac's right. Corporal Mitchell landed 50 yards away, shed his chute, and unslung his M1 Carbine, which was also loaded with modified magazines. Mitchell ran toward Kovac's position in a low crouch. German fire pursued him. Mitchell dove into the furrow next to Kovac. Tree line? At least squad strength, maybe more. MG-42 somewhere in there. Mitchell nodded, sighted his carbine, and fired 5 rounds. His customized magazines fed perfectly, despite his running approach and diving impact into the dirt. The German MG-42 machine gun opened up again, a distinct, rapid roar. The bullets tore through the beat field, spraying dirt and plant matter everywhere. Kovac and Mitchell pressed flat to the ground. "We have to move," Mitchell yelled. "The drainage ditch is 30 yards to the left."
They moved together, using fire and movement tactics. Mitchell fired short, suppressing bursts, while Kovac sprinted. Then Kovac fired while Mitchell sprinted. Standard tactics. Both men's carbines functioned flawlessly. They reached the drainage ditch. 4 other paratroopers were already there. Private Chen with his M1 Garand, Private Walsh with the BAR, and 2 men from the 2nd Squad, both carrying Garands. Anyone wounded?